Brian Burrough is a special correspondent at Vanity Fair magazine and the author of 5 books, including the #1 New York Times bestseller, Barbarians at the Gate, and the best-selling Public Enemies, America's Greatest Crime Wave, and the Birth of the FBI, 1933-1934. Barbarians at the Gate is a history of the fight for control of R.J.R. Nabisco. The book has been hailed as one of the most influential business narratives of all time and was made into an HBO movie in 1993. Public Enemies is the account of the 1930s crime wave that brought notorious criminals like Bonnie and Clyde to America's front pages. A major movie was based on the book, also named Public Enemies, was released by Universal Studios in 2009. Born in 1961, he was raised in Temple, Texas, so right up the road. So a neighbor. He graduated from the University of Missouri School of Journalism in 1983. From 1983 to 1992, he was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, where he reported from Dallas, Houston, Pittsburgh, and during the late 1980s covered the mega busy merger and acquisitions beat in New York. In addition to consulting work for 60 Minutes and various Hollywood studios, Burrough has authored numerous book reviews and op-ed articles in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post. He has appeared on Today, Good Morning America, and in many documentary films. He lives in Summit, New Jersey, has a son that's at Rice University and one in high school. Tonight he'll be talking about The Big Rich, the rise and fall of the great Texas oil fortunes, which enjoyed 3 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and has garnered rave reviews. Burrough profiles the big 4 oil dynasties of H.L. Hunt, Roy Cullen, Clint Murchison, and Sid Richardson, along with their cronies, rivals, and families. Mrs. Bush has just finished reading this book and says she enjoyed reading it very much because she knows a lot of the people that are in it. Please help me welcome Brian Burrough.
Warm, thank you. I got water and everything. Hi, y'all. You can relax. I'm very easy. I'm not going to read you, much. This is, authors, I hope this doesn't sound too hoity-toity. You have relationships with each of your books. Maybe it's like children. Some was the problem child. Some was so easy to raise. I have a particularly warm spot for The Big Rich, which was my most recent book, because quite literally it allowed me to come home again. After 20 years living up north, mostly in New Jersey, mostly in the New Jersey, New York area, I came back to Texas to do this book. And I had not really been on the ground in Texas since leaving in 1983. So it had been 25 years. I had not, other than going through the airports, I hadn't been back in Dallas. I could not believe what had happened to Houston. San Antonio looked pretty much the same. And I didn't really care how much it all changed because it still felt the same. And while I had a ball doing the book, and I'll talk about that in just a second, it was during writing this book at some point that I realized I really didn't want to die in New Jersey. And I began thinking about, there's nothing wrong with New Jersey. I just wanted to, you've got to find that number of years on this earth, and I wanted to come back. And so I have. I'm in the process of I'm in Austin about a third, 40% of the time now, and trying to get that closer to 100%. But it's one of the things I'll always remember about the book was just a chance to re-engage with Texas because, being a Texan, it's somewhat like being an Aggie. It makes you feel a little special. It's an unspoken fraternity. I almost want to apologize a little bit before I start talking about the book because it has been a couple of years since I've been out actively talking about it. And my recollection of all my best stuff, it may not be as sharp as it might be, but my enthusiasm for it remains as bright as it was when I started the book. This was a funny genesis of a book. I'm very bad at ideas. They take me forever. And this was the one idea that I've ever had that came from somebody else, amazingly. And I was sitting with my editor having lunch at some hoity-toity place, and we were talking through ideas, and he said, how about something on Texas oil? And the whole idea for the book, everything about it, I had in 10 seconds. I immediately realized the families, the stories that I grew up with in the 70s and the 80s. I moved to Texas when I was 9 years old-ish, in 69, 70. And if you were around in the 70s and 80s, you remember the stories about H.L. Hunt and all that stuff. They were in the news. And I just immediately knew the families. And then I immediately knew the rule of four. The best narratives are four stories. And I knew the four families immediately. And this was, let's, for sake of argument, say this was at 1:15 on a Friday afternoon. We had a deal in place, like for an advance and what the book was going to be and everything by 5 o'clock, by the end of business that day. It was an incredibly, as children go, it was an easy birth, and it was a joy to do. Not least because I didn't have to talk to that many people. Like a lot of writers, documents and history are so much easier than dealing with actual people because they don't argue with you quite as much. But you know, I mean, there was a significant amount of interviewing that went into the book. But initially, I plunged into not this facility, but an awful lot of facilities around the state. I went to places I'd never gone to. I mean, the Rosenberg Library in Galveston, just all sorts of places. And it was an enormous amount of fun. And I was stunned because, you know, I took Texas history like most of y'all. And most of what we learn is 1836 to 1846. And I realized that there was, I didn't want to write a silly book about silly rich Texans. I wanted to write a book about how we became modern Texas. Especially, look, I can't tell you that these four families created modern Texas, but they very much, along with many of their brethren and peers, created the image of modern Texas, created the image that became so popular in the post-war years, and that is of, you know, big cigar-smoking, nouveau riche oil men. The caricature that, you know, I think much of the world still belabors. You know, I can quote what the song "Breakfast in America." Can't we have kippers for breakfast, mommy dear? They got to have them in Texas because everyone's a millionaire. You know, and I realized that the stories and the myths surrounding these families had created this larger myth about modern Texas, and that was tremendously exciting because I knew that a lot of what I wanted to write about had not been written about for 30 years, really had been out of the press, newspapers and magazines since the 70s and 80s, since many of these families were going bankrupt. And I wanted to write about kind of the image of how we became Texas. And so much of it was because I felt we were losing all that. As I say at one point in the introduction, I felt when I came back that it still felt like Texas, but it wasn't quite as Texas as it used to be. It wasn't Ohio, but as I said, it was beginning to feel a little bit like a Texas-flavored Ohio. And I wanted to capture some of these stories about what I thought made 20th century Texas so special before you couldn't get them anymore. There are still people, there are still family members, there are still sons and grandsons that I could talk to, some of which badly did not want to be talked to or they went off the record. So it was a lot of fun. I rarely read from books because I don't think my writing is particularly sprightly. It's serviceable. But in this book, I made a decision at some point that I wanted to write what they call in Time magazine the billboard paragraph, or at the Wall Street Journal, George and my old alma mater, they call it the nut graph, where you just you kind of take the reader by the shirt and say, this is what the book is. And I did that here, and it's only it's 4 paragraphs, so it's not gonna keep you. And I always come back to it because it's, of all the books I've written, it's the only one where I ever did it in 4 paragraphs. And I look back on this, and what stunned me is I remember sitting in my office. I wrote this in about 15, 20 minutes. And then in the first year of the book, these books take me 4 to 5 years, and never changed a word of it, and it's still the same. There is a legend in America about Texas, about the fabulously wealthy oilmen there who turned gushers of sweet black crude into raw political power, who cruised their personal jets over ranches measured in Rhode Island, who sipped bourbon and branch on their private islands as they plotted and schemed to corner entire international markets. In popular culture, the Texas oilman tends to come in two guises: the overbearing, dim-witted high roller with a blonde on either arm, and his evil twin, the oilman of Oliver Stone and Mother Jones, the black Stetson villain whose millions pull the levers of power in Washington. He can be young and conflicted and obscenely rich, as in James Dean portrayal of the Wildcatter Jet Rink in Giant, or smooth and conniving and obscenely rich, like J.R. Ewing of television's Dallas, but he is almost always crass and loud and a tad mysterious, a classic American other. There is truth behind the legend, a surprising amount, in fact. There really were poor Texas boys who discovered gushing oil wells and became overnight billionaires, patriarchs of squabbling families who owned private islands and colossal mansions and championship football teams, who slept with movie stars and jousted with presidents and tried to corner an international market or two. Back before television, before lifestyles of the rich and famous, they were the original Beverly Hillbillies, counting their millions around the cement pond as they ogled themselves on the cover of Time. They helped make Texas oil an economic and political powerhouse, a world whose contributions, large and small, from Enron and 2 George Bushes to the Super Bowl, shaped the America we know today. This is their story, told through the lives of the 4 Texas families and a few of their peers who rose the highest and in some cases fell the hardest. Each of their patriarchs began in obscurity, and all, through an historic quirk of fate, laid the foundations of their fortunes in a single 4-year span. They married, bore, and lost children, and became the country's first shirt-sleeved billionaires, transforming America's idea of what it meant to be rich, even as they played host to kings and queens and accumulated every toy of their age: mansions and ranches, and castles, airplanes and yachts, and limousines, skyscrapers, hotels, and cabinet members. As they reshuffled the deck of America's most powerful families, eventually helping to propel 3 of their favorite sons into the Oval Office, the country was enthralled by them and suspicious, then after a fateful fusillade of gunfire, came to view them as nefarious caricatures, that being the Kennedy assassination. In time, their salad days dissolved into a sordid litany of debauchery, family feuds, scandals, and murder, until collapsing in a tangle of rancorous bankruptcies. Some survived, some didn't. A few count their millions today. As the movies say about almost every story set in Texas, theirs is a big, sprawling American epic. And that was the book I wanted to write. And I knew immediately who the 4 families had to be, the Hunts, of course, because they're the biggest of the big and always were. People don't even talk about the Hunts anymore because there's 3,000 of them. I knew I wanted to do the Murchisons. They're the Cowboys. Nobody remembers the elder Murchison, the first one. They only remember Clint Jr., who had the Cowboys. I knew I wanted to do Sid Richardson, Clint's best friend, in large part because he was the uncle of the Bass brothers, who became the second richest family. And I knew I had to do Sid Richardson. I just didn't think nobody had ever written anything about him. There'd been one magazine article about this man in his life. And then there was Roy Cullen, who was the first seriously wealthy wildcatter in Houston. And so I knew I had the benefit of a biography. He'd written an autobiography in 1954. So I knew there was something there. Anyway, the story really starts. There's so much of it about that people don't understand. And one of the things I love in talking about this book is, first off, my editor, one thing he said back to me when I described this book after those 10 seconds was, well, I don't know much about Texas, but I know Texans love books about Texas. And it turned out to be true, because I'm telling you, 70% of the copies of this book, which sold fairly darn well, were sold down here. So I'm very grateful for that. Thank you all. I love talking about this to Texans of a certain age, those of you who may remember the Shamrock Hotel in Houston, or may remember some of these people. But the people that it's most fun to talk about this book to is newcomers, mostly from the north, but that's okay. And they come down and they don't quite get it. They don't get the whole Texas myth image thing. And it's a tremendous amount of fun talking to people about it. The first misconception I always run into is people always think that oil started here with Spindletop. And of course it did, but it wasn't really the beginning. For those of you who are not astute historians of the oil industry, and I know mostly what I've researched from the smart books that others read, most of you know that oil was first found in Pennsylvania, and it wasn't terribly important in America. It was basically made into kerosene. And it was a tiny little business. Nobody paid much attention until this guy, whose name some of you may remember, named Bud Higgins, his official name is Patillo Higgins, decided to get somebody to try to dig this mound south of Beaumont. It was a salt dome in 1901. Everybody thought he was crazy. And he actually was, but even crazy people occasionally have a good idea. And this fella did. He thought that there was oil or something there. Long story short, they brought in people. They hit a gusher. You all now, everybody knows what a gusher is. There'd never been a gusher in the world. This was the first gusher to fly up in the air, to be a gusher. It gushed for weeks until people could figure out how to stop it. What few people appreciate is that the amount of oil that came out of that gusher in the first 3 days, it's estimated, was more than the entire world production of oil in every country. Russia was the top producer in 3 days. And like in 6 days, they say it was more that came out of Spindletop was more oil that had ever been produced in the history of the world. So everybody thinks, oh, Texans suddenly got crazy rich. That's where H.L. Hunt came from. No, because Texas was not what it is now. It was a poor, rural state with almost no manufacturing. And so the people who rushed in and quickly took control of all that oil land at Spindletop and then at Sour Lake and Batson and all these other little remember fields were a handful of wealthy Texans, but an awful lot of rich eastern and northern oil companies that came in. Sun, Shell, all of them came in and basically took control of the business. Texans, treated Spindletop and those early oil fields as kind of a classroom where Texans began to learn the business. And it's funny because by World War I, pretty much the Texas oil industry, it existed, but it was maybe fourth or fifth in the country. California had more production. Kansas had more oil production. There's this great story I found about a famous geologist from Texaco who remembers people being told in 1960, the geologist, would you get out of Texas? Everybody knows this industry is dying. There's not going anywhere, pal. Come to Oklahoma. That's where the oil is. And so what happened, what so often happens after it happened after World War II, it happened after World War I, is an immense, obviously, uptick in industrial activity, in this case, cars. The number of automobiles on American highways went from, I don't know, pick a number, 10,000 to 10 million. And there was a massive run that began in 1918 on oil exploration. Well, as so often happens, there was too many people. So there was room for little guys. And the first little guys, they're called wildcatters now, but by then nobody knew the term. I mean, Texans became very good at it. It was a funny deal. There's some Oklahoma wildcatters, but nobody really goes around talking about Kansas wildcatters or Iowa wildcatters. There was something about our penchant for individualism and for frontier kind of independence that seemed to convince an awful lot of individual Texas men that they could go out there on their own and find oil where big oil companies couldn't. Long story short, some of them found a lot in the 20s. We began to have our first Texas oil millionaires. But they weren't silly crazy. They weren't serious money. There were a bunch of them got together and formed the Humble Company, which of course became Exxon. They were our first moneyed oilmen. But the gentlemen that I'm writing about were beyond that exponentially. They would be Rockefeller wealthy. These 20s oilmen, they were kind of what we would consider dentist wealthy, if you will. And what changed everything was the Great Depression. And when you're writing history from the viewpoint of a journalist, and I grew up a journalist, not a newspaper reporter, not an academic, you get tremendously excited when you're a journalist when you come up with a scoop. when you're writing history, a scoop can just be, in my case, just an idea, a fresh new idea. And I have about 3 in this book. And the first big one is the idea that all these families and in the entire concept of super wealthy Texas oilmen was all created, the wealth and the image, between 1931 and 1935. And it's an entirely new concept. You can go back and read the Oil and Gas Journal from 1931, and if you do, you'll fall asleep as often as I did, because it's pretty boring stuff. But what you realize is the canard was always that individual Texans got money, found all this oil because major oil companies poo-pooed it. So H.L. Hunt famously found the East Texas oil field, largest oil field in history at the time. And the canard has always been, well, Hunt found that and others found their own little fields, sorry about that, because the big oil companies just thought, oh, that can't be that big a deal. In fact, it had nothing to do with it. It had to do with because it was the Depression. The big oil companies had no money to explore any longer. As a result, individuals jumped in. H.L. Hunt was worth $600 million by 1935. He was penniless in 1930. Sid Richardson, maybe $30 million. He found his out in Winkler County. Hugh Cullen found his almost all along the Gulf Coast, going just deeper, taking these old, worn fields that nobody liked. It was somewhat like fracking. He decided to drill for oil where people had stopped looking. In fact, it's very much like fracking. The whole boom that's happening right now is exactly what happened in Texas in the Depression, where the major oil companies just said, we don't have money to go do this all. Well, here's, y'all go look. We'll make a deal. And Hunt, Richardson, all of them had deals with the majors, where they went out and took all the risk, but they got to drill on the majors' land, and the majors would retain, let's say, a 20% share, and then typically buy them out of their first production. Hunt, Richardson, Cullen, Murchison all got filthy rich, because for the most part, with Murchison as the primary exception, they kept their stuff. And they got seriously, seriously rich as a result. And the amazing thing is, all during the 30s, these guys are getting Bill Gates-like rich. And Mr. Cullen quickly builds the largest mansion in Houston. Mr. Murchison builds a mansion in Dallas on what used to be a polo field. He has his own private airport out back. He builds what's believed to be Texas's first private swimming pool. Laugh, but come on, it's still pretty cool to be the first person with a pool anywhere. And then Richardson and Murchison, who were childhood friends. I should tell you a bit more personally about them in a second. I will. They did get into a little competition, like men tend to do, and so when Mr. Murchison bought his own private island, what's the name of it? I'm drawing a blank on it. Down off Matagorda. He bought the southern half of Matagorda. Mr. Richardson came back and bought his own private island a couple of miles away. But what's amazing is as they're engaging in this just massive orgy of spending, the type of stuff that would be in the pages of People magazine now, the way we celebrate, private gathering of assets. This happened as if no one in the world knew it. It's not only no one in the world knew that they were buying private islands and building private airports and doing all these things. It's that no one knew they existed. If you go back, Mr. Hunt got a little bit of play in the Dallas Morning News because of his control of the East Texas field. Mr. Cullen, who became the wealthiest man in Texas, maybe 4 mentions in the Houston paper. They were utterly anonymous, which is just almost unthinkable now. But until you think about, this was the Depression. Even after the Depression, people were worried about Hitler. They were worried about everything except the accumulation of private wealth in a business that received very little publicity, and whose details, who owns how much percent of this well. You go back, if you didn't get an oil and gas degree of some type or petroleum engineering, you can't You can't understand half of the stuff. Even the stuff in the regular newspapers, the Houston Chronicle and Dallas Morning News, it's hard to understand. Their anonymity lasted until 1948. And this is an amazing thing. And I was kind of amazed because this was one of the other concepts in the book that was entirely new. And that surprised me that our own academics, our Texas academics, hadn't written a lot about. What happened was very, very simple. None of these people had ever received any type of publicity. And then suddenly in 1948, I believe it was, there was a woman who was the Dallas bureau chief of Life magazine, important magazine back then, maybe the most important, caught wind of, they already knew there was a lot of drilling going on in Texas. There's a lot of post-war stuff. Caught wind that some of these guys might be seriously wealthy. Well, how much? Her editors in New York saying, oh, yeah, right, sure, they're as important as the Rockefellers, sure, lady. Challenged her to investigate and come up with the math. And in April 5th, 1948, Life magazine ran an article with an ambushed photo of H.L. Hunt on the cover. They ambushed him outside the Baker Hotel in Dallas on the way to a poker game, his evening poker game. And the headline underneath it said, "Is this the wealthiest man in America?" And it was it is, to this moment, one of the most enormously influential magazine covers, I think, and underappreciated in the 20th century, because it ignited, it did a lot of things. For one thing, it changed the image of Texas and Texas woman forever. Before that moment, Texas was known, if you go back and look at Texas jokes and Texas histories, Texas was known for cowboys, longhorn cattle, and the idea that we all shot each other a lot. Violence. The idea of oil was not part of the mythos of Texas. There actually was a couple of, there was a Clark Gable movie where he played a Texas woman, but it really wasn't part of the, there didn't seem to be, it wasn't part of the mythos. And with that, suddenly, every reporter in the East Coast, and that's where all the major media outlets remained, of course, in 1940, come flooding into Texas. And they all returned to publish in Life, Fortune, every newspaper you can imagine, all these stories of these crazy nouveau riche Texans. At the same standpoint, those articles created an image, largely true, that we were undergoing an economic boom. And I only bring that part up because we're here at the George Bush Presidential Library, and among those earnest young men who read that coverage was George Bush. And in 1948, 49, 50, decides to move to Midland, Texas, because everybody seemed to be a millionaire, and it seemed to be easy money. And, obviously did quite well. But it was the first, Texas, until 1948, was amazingly, suffocatingly parochial. We had not had major immigration into the state probably since the Germans who populate all of central Texas, It had been 80 years. And the first massive waves of northern immigration we get after that period. There's a million ways I can talk about this, but I just have to... What interested me most was beginning in 48, suddenly there's this wave of publicity about Texas. Everybody wants to write about Texas millionaires. There's suddenly all these books, The Lusty Texans of Dallas, all these movies with first Texas heroes, later Texas villains, and it's this new national stereotype. Remember how none of us had a national stereotype of computer nerds until Bill Gates, computer billionaires? It was very much that type of moment. And for 4 or 5 years, it was a honeymoon. Everybody thought Texas women were kind of funny and harmless and likable and, good for Texas. Most of my oilmen, as I think of them, my 4 families were too smart to engage with journalists, especially northern journalists. And they kind of retreated. They didn't want the publicity. But there was one oilman who did, and he's really the 5th oilman that I write about. And his name, I'm always interested when I say the name Glenn McCarthy, how many people know the name Glenn McCarthy? I knew it growing up, but I don't think many people, unless you're a history geek, many people under 60 know who Glenn McCarthy was. Glenn McCarthy was, from 1948 to 1953, the most famous oilman in Texas. He wasn't biggest. He was probably the 5th biggest after my 4. But he was the most famous. if you thought of Texas Oil, Texas Oilman, you thought of Glenn McCarthy. Glenn McCarthy, long story short, poor kid from Houston's 3rd Ward, finds an awful lot of oil in and around Beaumont during World War II. And suddenly, out of nowhere in 1945, announces that he wants to make his lot in life. He's fairly rich now. He wants to be known. And so he announces he's going to build a hotel. It's 1945. It's the end of the war. Nobody cares, right? It's Houston. Nobody's paying attention. And then he starts to build it, all through 46, all through 47. And he starts to put out these press releases. And he announces, and shows every intention, that he is going to build the largest structure between, essentially, at least Chicago and L.A. I'm trying to remember what I wrote. It might have been between New York and L.A. And to publicize it, he wants it to be, an opening unlike any other. So he wants movie stars to come to his opening. There's no way to get movie stars to come to Houston, Texas. So he goes in 46 and opens a movie studio and makes a movie with Natalie Wood and Walter Brennan. It's an awful thing, but it's an excuse for him to actually charter airplanes and get movie stars to come to his opening of this hotel. And it all happens. It all utterly happens exactly as he said. The Shamrock opens 1948. It's in Life, it's in Time, it's in newspapers around the world. And it's this beautiful microcosm of Texas coming into the modern era, because it's all these nouveau riche Texans, women in furs they bought just for the occasion, men in tuxes that they don't fit, everybody tripping on high heels that they probably have never worn since their junior prom. And it is a massive, what's a nice clean word, screw up. What happens, it is actually broadcast live over the CBS radio network, ladies and gentlemen. And that night, the PR system calling everyone in for the beginning of the program that's going to be on radio, in which the movie stars will perform and the hotel will be, it doesn't work. So they start the radio program a lot by themselves. Then the crowd hears that the radio program is starting, and they literally start stampeding, all these men in tuxes and women in diamonds, all stampeding into the auditorium while live radio is going on. And and who is it? It's Dorothy Lamour is the host, and she starts to complain. I can't hear myself. Who are these people? Tell them to shut up. And they start telling jokes, and eventually there's so much screaming and Texans knocking over tables and running across the stage that they have to go off the air. And it's just this wonderful moment of an immature society beginning to mature. I actually tell a coda to that story. Fred, you would appreciate this, because this is your type of gig. This famous famous Nixon fundraiser in 1971, 23 years later. And it's all the second-generation Murchisons. It's the Bass Brothers. It's Leon Jaworski from Houston. It's Baker. It's Botts. It's everybody. And it's at John Connolly's ranch in Floresville. And it's champagne and helicopters. And it's smooth. And Nixon loves it. And, of course, he romances all the oilmen. Nothing particularly amazing about it. It's just a political fundraiser. But it's like in 23 years you can turn and say, wow, Texans learned how to behave. It's just... Anyway, that was all part of a honeymoon period that Texans had. It began to go south, well, a number of things. There's one of the great untold stories in the book that I was proudest of that I got from the archives of the Equitable Life Insurance Company, which funded Glenn McCarthy, was the way that they slowly foreclosed on Mr. McCarthy, and he lost everything and became kind of a grumbling drunk around Houston for many, many years. I remember the first time I ever went to the Hilton, when it was the Shamrock Hilton, because Hilton bought it in the late 70s. Mom and Dad took me there. I remember that huge pool. I never understood the history. I never knew who Glenn McCarthy was. And then I went to Anita Craning's wedding there in the penthouse in 1983. And I never understood any of this until researching this book. And I remember researching this book going, how can I not know this? People my age that live in Texas should know this stuff. This is as much a part of our history as Sam Houston and Mira B. Lamar. I mean, maybe it's not important in the way that it didn't get us independence, but it shaped the image of the way the rest of the world sees us and the way I think a lot of us see us. Anyway, long story short, our honeymoon with the national media didn't last too long, as rich Texans tend to do. There was a little bit of political overreaching involving some exchanges of bags of cash that may or may not, but almost certainly were illegal. In Washington, it looked like we were trying to buy, but were unable to buy passage of a natural gas bill in 1952. This all broke, and suddenly, like someone had put off a light switch, the idea of fun, nouveau riche Texas oil men disappeared in the blink of an eye, to be replaced by this caricature of evil Texas oil men. That and think back to all the. Do you remember the $1 Billion Brain, the one where they had this was a Lynn Dayton novel turned into a movie, in which a Texas oilman tried to take over the Soviet Union. Yes, the Soviet Union was really crazy. And you go back, there's all these movies and plays and novels beginning in 1956-57 and continuing to this day. The Kennedy assassination certainly fed a lot of this with, evil Texas oilmen. You see it in, there's this excruciating scene in JFK, in the Oliver Stone's movie. An amazing bit of cinema and an utterly, obviously absurd, to my mind, story. And he still conjures, this is in 1988, this imagined scene of, was it Nixon sitting around with all these gruff Texas oilmen talking about, we just got to get rid of that Kennedy. Just, ridiculously stereotyped stuff. I use the four families and McCarthy to show the ups and the downs. Just about the time that everything went bad, which was 1957, I mean in terms of image, any of y'all in the business will know that that's also when the business went bad, for the simple reason that they started discovering an awful lot of oil in the Middle East, in places that we'd never heard of, Kuwait and Qatar. And by 1957, 1958, not many people wanted to buy Texas oil anymore, and they weren't. And by the 1960s, major oilmen were not only not billionaires anymore, but they were going bankrupt. John Meekum in Houston, who was probably the fourth or fifth largest wildcatter in the 60s, went bankrupt shortly after buying the Houston Chronicle. Glenn McCarthy was never the same. He basically ended up running a strip club. The Hunts kept their money, barely. The Murchisons, Mr. Murchison, the older Murchison, died in 67. His son, Clint Murchison, most people, and it's Murchison, they pronounce it with a K, not a CH, of course became famous for owning cowboys. And then, unfortunately, he kind of discovered recreational drugs and recreational young women, and the businesses kind of went very fast until they went bankrupt. It was just unbearably. They went bankrupt, and he, at the same time where he goes through some unbearable death, it's frighteningly sad. Hugh Cullen, who absolutely no one remembers Hugh Cullen. He died in 1957. They don't remember him in large part because he gave away 90% of his wealth by the time he died to the Cullen Foundation, which when it was founded in 1948 was actually the third largest foundation after the Rockefeller and Ford foundations in the country. And it still exists. It's not what it once was, but it's still a good thing, and the Cullens are still upright, nice people who live and work in Houston. Of course, the ones who did it the smartest was Sid Richardson, who died in 1959, begat most of his money to his young nephew, Perry Bass, who had 4 sons. And they became the Bass Brothers. And they did it the smart way. They went to good schools. They learned how to run their money. They learned how to invest in the in the stock market, and more than anything, they learned how to invest alongside very smart people. And that's why their relatively paltry fortune in the 60s, I think I estimated about $50 million, ultimately became worth over $1 billion. The Hunt's money is so fractured, none of them are worth much more than $100 million, more than a unit. Sometimes that's what they call it at that level. $100 million is a unit. How many units you got, partner? I'm up to 2. So I don't think any of the Hunts are even good for a unit anymore. Shame. Bunker Hunt, some of you may remember, Bunker and his brother Herbert actually are still alive. Some of you may remember them because Bunker Hunt was actually briefly in about 1973 the richest man in the world. Not that anybody noticed it at the time. He found a very large oil field in Libya that he controlled outright. But he's known mainly today for this wonderful scheme to try to corner the international silver market, 1979, 1980, which was just so much fun just to tell again, to introduce two new generations of America to really legendary stupidity. This was stupidity on a monumental scale. You know, it's the answer to the question, you know, what's the quickest way to have $1 billion in the bank account? You know, invest a lot, you know, give $6 billion to Bunker and Herbert Hunt. Because they lost, you know, they lost everything, and they didn't lose everything, of course, because they had some trust. And there was actually, I saw an article in the Morning News or Texas Monthly or somebody about 5 years ago, which said, you know, believe it or not, these guys are still alive. You know, they're probably down to their last 30 or 40 million. Sorry. I think I can't talk about everybody I talked to in the book, but they wouldn't talk to me. They said, happy to have you do it. But they did send a message afterwards that they kind of liked the book. So that was nice, because you don't want to have people angry. I misspelled a couple of things that I'm embarrassed about. But other than that, the people in the book reacted pretty well. I was surprised, because you never know. I don't want to make people angry. I want to write accurate history if I can, and I want to preserve it for people who don't know it. And it was an awful lot of fun, and I would talk about it for another 3 hours, but everybody has to get home and go to bed because it's a school night. But they did say that if anybody has any questions, and I gather there are people here that are professionally good at coming up with questions, I'm told, that I'll be happy to sit here as long as you have them. So thank you very, very much for coming. Okay, now I'm going to eat my words. Anybody, not even a planted question? Warren, you've got to have planted a question at this point.
So George Bush came out here in 1948.
Yeah.
He goes to work. He had a family had a friend out there. He goes to work there. Can you talk about people like George Bush who came from the East? I wouldn't say George Bush made a fortune, but he made enough money where he could sometimes go on office.
What happened was, it was very much like any type of boom towny atmosphere, except it was a boom state, if you will. And it was the place for young, wealthy heirs who wanted to stand out from their parents to come, circa 48 to 53. I can't document this independently, but I've read it in enough places that I believe it, including Life magazine at the time, that Midland and Odessa each had a Harvard club, a Princeton club, a Yale club in Odessa, Texas in 1948. You know, he worked for Dresser. He was just sales. That Studebaker y'all have, I mean, he drove around to places like Muleshoe, selling to guys named Jethro out, you know, you want a compressor. That's what Dresser sold. And Mr. Bush, as I'm recalling it now, like Sid Bass, who got very lucky, and he started investing alongside a young man named Richard Rainwater, who became kind of the Warren Buffett of his day. George Bush was lucky enough to run into a young guy named Hugh Lidke, who became one of the smartest oil men, really, of the latter half of the 20th century, probably not celebrated outside the oil patch the way he should be. Mr. Lidke, and to a lesser extent Mr. Bush, I really believe, and I think I said so in the book, really personified the second wave of modern corporate oil men who were fine to go out there and get their hands dirty, but they understood Wall Street, they understand IPOs, they understood oil companies. And I didn't write very much about Mr. Bush because I wanted to use him as an example of this kind of second wave. But, you know, Mr. Bush did fairly well there with Mr. Lidke. The fact was, Zapata, the company that they founded, or that Mr. Bush founded, was mostly family money and family friends. You know, kind of, you know, investor groups that backed the new companies. And in all the biographies I've read, and maybe I've read two, they always kind of suggest that somehow this means Mr. Bush's business success and the growth of his fortune is somehow discountable because Daddy's friend, you know, his dad's friends helped him. Well, that's the way capitalism works, and that's the way it worked for them. And they were very effective. It was a very good company. Mr. Bush, I think, was one of those people that, frankly, there's this bug that people have. I've never had it, but there are people that have it. This political thing. They want to go into politics, and Mr. Bush basically threw it all away to go, you know, into just crazy, you know, being a Republican in Texas in 1961 was just shoot yourself in the head. What were you doing? You know, yeah, they were crazy people, and Mr. Bush didn't care. He thought you could be a country club Republican, could succeed in Texas politics, and it was a laughable idea. And you know, despite Goldwater, despite everything, they also, and mostly with, you know, the foresight of oilmen like Hugh Cullen, who began founding the Texas Republican in the Republican Party in the late 40s, they did quite well. And Mr. Bush, to his one of the things I liked the most about him was once he retired, and you know, he went back and he got a house in Memorial. You know, he came back. Everybody knew his real home was Kennebunkport. But he got the house in Memorial, and that mattered to people like me who wanted to believe that he didn't just come down here to do that classic stake my claim and then never come back like so many congressmen, you know, end up doing. Yes, ma'am. Bloomfield, right next to Montclair. Great Italian restaurant right there.
I don't know much about the hunt. I've heard the name vaguely. So what happened to the fortune?
They just had many children. They just had tons of children. Well, first off, God, I can't even remember the. Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't tell you the good stuff. Okay, Mr. Hunt didn't just have children. Mr. Hunt had families. He was a bigamist. See, I did continually leave out the good stuff. Well, I'm sorry. I didn't want to come across as indiscreet or silly. Mr. Hunt had a family in the 20s. And long about, I can't remember the dates now, I'm sorry. He went and started another one with another lady. This is before he came to Dallas. By the time he came to Dallas, he had essentially a wife and kids, one group in Arkansas and another in Louisiana, ultimately moved them all into Dallas, ended up leaving one of these women. So, you know, she was banished to Long Island. And then he ultimately ended up with another wife in the 50s. And this is who's the likable Ray Hunt. He's the one everybody likes, the smart one. He's not like his half brother. He's serious. And so Mr. Hunt just, I can't even remember the numbers are all in here. Let's say he had 13 kids, and they start having kids. Well, you know, once you start cutting $10 billion a few ways, you know, it's not going to last forever. And certainly Bunker and Herbert, who were two of the first 6 or 7, lost an awful lot of it. And Bunker, you know, Bunker was there were 3 families, the last 2 in secret. The first family is Bunker, Herbert, Carolyn, I can't remember all of them. Hassie, the second oldest, who was clearly had schizophrenia and ended up having a lobotomy, and just sad, that's in there too. Bunker was always the one that people said reminded him the most of H.L. Because H.L. Hunt, again, leaving out the good stuff, you know, he was not really an oil man. He only discovered oil in the 1920s when he was a professional card player playing cards in an Arkansas oil town. And he started, you know, oh, what's this oil thing? And kind of got into it that way. It's a really great story. My book totally stands on the shoulders of a couple of great Hunt books that were written in the early 80s when their empire was starting to fall apart. So for the Hunts, at least, I have some good news stuff, but for the hunts, the challenge for me was shrinking everything down into a book where you're telling the stories of 5 or 6 families. So Bloomberg is a great town. Bloomfield. Yes, ma'am. No. You were talking about Dallas, the TV show? Yeah. No, I just, no. Other than I was trying to get the facts behind the fiction, if you will. J.R. Ewing is very much a product of this myth-making that I was talking about. You know, by the 70s, when the energy crisis, remember, was the greatest thing to ever happen to the Texas economy. Suddenly, oilmen were making money again, beginning in 73, 70 through 81. And that kind of suddenly, the moment that happened, everybody ginned up all the old Texas oil things. Oh, those crazy Texas oil guys, they're back. And so they did a TV show. Yeah, they made a TV show and it became really big. Anybody else?
Yeah, you talk about the wildcat, and it reminds me of the George Mitchell equivalent today. I mean, George Mitchell today in terms of shale gas and everything else, and persistence to look where no one else is going.
It is absolutely incredible. I just read there's 2 new fracking books. One's called The Frackers. It's just out by Greg Zuckerman. I reviewed it. And then there's another one coming out by another Wall Street Journal reporter. Apparently they hate each other. Coming out in like February. It's exactly what happened in the 30s. I mean, the biggest development in the oil industry since Spindletop, I'm not going to bore you with it, which is hydraulic fracturing coupled with horizontal drilling. And it's perfected by a bunch of independents. Mitchell Energy, come on, they've been around forever. They've never done anything. They were drilling in rock. You know, they were rockheads, and that's what people called them. Chesapeake, these people in Oklahoma, nobody took these people seriously. This was one really where the majors probably should have followed, but you know they did not take they didn't spot the technology seriously, and it's exactly like what happened in the 30s, and it's absolutely amazing. There's never been this fracking thing. I was writing about it in the Times in this review. I can't believe we're actually, you know, I don't want to say we're going to be energy independent as a country, but the importance of Middle Eastern oil geopolitically is almost, we're getting to the point where we don't really have to listen to Saudi Arabia anymore about anything. And I don't know if that really bothers much anybody. So don't get me started. Anyway, y'all are so nice to have me here. This is a wonderful facility. It's always a wonderful time to come be an Aggie for a night or two. So thank you.